In Exalted, you play as one of the Exalted, someone chosen by a god to be their champion. The game's central conflict is between the Solar Exalted and the Dragon-blooded of the realm, with the Solars acting as protagonists born into a world that they were made to lead, but that is now against them. During the development of first edition, the first lead developer Rob Hatch conceptualized a game where you could play as many different Exalt types out of the core book. The second lead developer Jeff Grabowski argued that presenting all Exalt types in one book made the game feel generic. He wanted every Exalt type to have their time to shine, so he only kept the Solars. By doing this, the Solars could be emphasized as the game's core protagonists, and more effort could be put into highlighting what it was that made them stand out. This was also done for the purpose of system design, because since the Solars were the mightiest of Exalted, designing their toolkit first would make it easier to design the other Exalts around it. With the Solar protagonists in the core book, another book had to be made to introduce their main antagonists in a playable state, the Dragon-blooded. A third book was later introduced with the Lunar Exalted, followed by the Sidereals and the Abyssals. At the end of first edition's run, you could play Solar, Dragon-blooded, Lunar, Sidereal, Abyssal, and Alchemical. You could even play as one of the Fair Folk despite them not being Exalted. Because all of these had been given their own books, they all felt like fleshed out characters that expanded the setting and presented new story hooks and narrative options. During the development of 2nd edition, the same Exalt types were presented in much the same way, with the Solars in the core book and the others in separate splat books. 2nd edition also introduced Infernal Exalted in a playable state, and while they came to be very controversial due to their lore, their system design inspired and encouraged fans to design their own charm trees for high-end Infernals called Devil Tigers. At the end of 2nd edition's run, Infernal homebrew dominated the community forums. 3rd edition wanted to revolutionize the game by changing past mistakes and making creation bigger and with more options. They wanted to make previous Exalt types more interesting, and many changes were made, most of them for the better. Due to the controversy surrounding 2nd edition's Infernal Exalted, 3rd edition set out to rework them from scratch, changing the lore, their castes, and their fundamental design. The 3rd edition Infernal book hasn't been released yet, so we don't know too much about them. 3rd edition also wanted to bring Alchemical Exalted into creation, adding lore to justify having some alchemicals be present in creation without having to bring in Autoton or the Locust Crusade metaplot. Finally, 3rd edition introduced new Exalt types in the form of Exigents, Liminals, and Getimians, though Exigents are the only ones of these with their own splat book so far. The Exigents were designed in part to replace the Devil Tiger niche from 2nd edition, allowing free customization for homebrewers without having to tie the character to Infernals. Instead, the Exigents were made central to the setting itself, a chosen of a lesser god. In practice, every individual Exigent could be seen as a separate Exalt type. Finally, we have Exalted Essence, where every Exalt type and 3rd edition's new ones were put into the same book. The question is whether what Jeff Grabowski argued during the creation of 1st edition is true with Exalted Essence, that the Exalts feel generic. The game does a good job at highlighting certain differences in the form of Exalt advantages and diverse anima powers to try to avoid this problem. Also, the context of the game is very different today than it was during the development of 1st edition, since we can now look back at decades of world building and use that to complement Exalted Essence instead of using it as a baseline to develop a gameline from. The reason for why Exalted Essence exists in the first place is partially due to community interest. Because of the slow release of 3rd edition, a game like Exalted isn't optimal. Unlike for World of Darkness, where every splat is its own game, Exalted splats are supplements that expand the core game. This makes it so that many consider an Exalted game complete only when all splats are available, and incomplete if they aren't. Exalted Essence is the compromise that makes the game complete. It offers the option of playing all Exalt types while pointing at 3rd edition for expanded lore. Any splat available in Essence that hasn't yet been released in 3rd edition will be somewhat generic until 3rd edition catches up, but they will still be available for players seeking a complete experience. Another reason for why Exalted Essence exists is due to the RPG community at large shifting away from crunchy game design, and many of the mechanical decisions that were originally celebrated in 3rd edition are now despised, and the game has a hard time attracting new players. I'm going to address the mechanics more in the next video. Before we go any further into this video, I want to let you all know that I recently dropped the community content for Exalted 3rd edition on the Storyteller's Vault. Ghost has rules for playing ghosts, including Deathlords, as well as new merits and over 200 Arcanoi on 76 pages. Even if you're not interested in playing ghosts, there are 94 Arcanoi with Eclipse keyword that you can use for your Solar character. Also, I want to mention NFL's beautiful custom-made D10s that you can get over on our shop. I have a link in the description below for how you can get those dice in a way that also helps me out a bit. What better way to try out your new ghost character than with some new dice, right? Anyway, promotion over. The character creation system has similarities in all 4 editions of the game, but there are also notable differences. First edition introduces the concept of nature, which is a basic description based on the character's self-perception. Some of the suggested natures listed in the core book are architect, caregiver, explorer, leader and survivor. These are mostly narrative in nature, but also offer an alternative way of gaining willpower. For example, the judge gains a willpower anytime they lead others to an amicable resolution, while a survivor gains a willpower whenever they survive a difficult situation through their own cunning and perseverance. Nature is only seen in 1st edition. 2nd edition introduces the concept of motivation, which is a phrase describing the character's driving goal. A motivation is supposed to be epic, such as restore the solar deliberative or destroy the realm. It replaces nature as an alternative way for characters to regain willpower. Instead of acting in accordance with your nature in 1st edition, you're now acting towards your motivation. 3rd edition uses neither nature nor motivation, and instead relies on intimacies to provide narrative depth. Intimacies were introduced already in 2nd edition, but also exist in Exalted Essence. They represent more general characteristics such as ties and principles the character has and that guide roleplay. Most Exalt types are divided into castes, or aspects for Dragonblooded, that all have their own unique anima powers. There are variations in anima powers between editions, but the main themes are largely intact. 1st and 2nd edition are the most similar because they have the most similar rule sets, while 3rd edition is to a large degree different and Exalted Essence does its own thing. I'm not going to compare all Exalt types in all editions, since that would take too long, but I want to compare the solar anima powers as an example of how the various editions may differ. Keep in mind that I'm going to reference some terms and rules without explaining them in depth. If you want to learn more about the differences in the mechanics, watch the next video. In 1st edition, Dawncast Solars can appear terrifying to others, forcing them to make valor checks or be unable to look at or oppose them. In 2nd edition they have the same power but with a different mechanical implementation where they become stronger against feared enemies. This was later buffed in the Scroll of Errata. In the Errata, Dawncasts are also immune to fear while their anima power is active. In 3rd edition, Dawncast gets a benefit to their base initiative when resetting after a decisive attack. This uses an entirely different combat engine from 1st and 2nd edition. 3rd edition also introduces new charm restrictions and conditional resets, and Dawncast can reset combat and movement charm restrictions regardless of condition. Finally, when it comes to their ability to terrify others, 3rd edition gives them a dice bonus for intimidation, but this is also the 1st edition where they can intimidate targets that are otherwise incapable of fear. However, unlike post-Errata 2nd edition, Dawncasts in 3rd edition are capable of feeling fear themselves. In Exalted Essence, Dawncast can passively defeat up to their Essence extras on their turn or inflict Essence dice and damage to battle groups. Battle groups also have it harder to check for rout against the Dawncast. They have an active effect that lets them add automatic successes to intimidation rolls, and just like in 3rd edition they can intimidate creatures otherwise incapable of fear. Finally, they can follow a ranged or close combat attack with a secondary attack using a different ability that targets a different opponent, with a few exceptions. In 1st edition, Zenithcast Solars can cremate corpses to help the ghost pass along and prevent them from being reanimated. They can inflict automatic aggravated damage to nearby creatures of darkness, except for Deathlords and Abyssals. They can also make themselves terrifying, just like Dawncasts, but only affecting creatures of darkness. In 2nd edition, Zeniths can also cremate corpses, but in place of the other effects they can improve their soak and minimum attack rolls against creatures of darkness, as well as radiate sunlight in an area as if it's noon. The only Zenith power that is similar in 3rd edition is their ability to cremate corpses. However, cremating a corpse in 3rd edition also lets the Solar perceive its strongest intimacies and choose to take them on. The Zenith can then choose to transfer the feelings associated with the taken intimacy into an object or person related to it. If the targeted corpse has suffered pain at the hands of another, the Zenith can transfer that pain into the one who caused it. Also, once per day, Zeniths in 3rd edition can make a decisive attack against a creature of darkness without resetting their initiative. They can also order dematerialized spirits to manifest without them having to pay the cost to do so. In Exalted Essence, trivial targets cannot ignore Zenith's social actions and will do as they ask unless their request is unreasonable. They can still cremate corpses to prevent them from being reanimated, and as an active effect, Zeniths can add automatic successes to presence and performance rolls, or instantly cremate undead extras or corpses they can perceive. They can add their essence in damage dice against undead battle groups. Finally, they can add their essence in automatic successes to attacks against creatures of darkness, dealing aggravated damage to them. The first time they reach iconic anima in a scene, battle groups consisting of creatures of darkness must check for rout with an increased difficulty. When it comes to Solars, Twilight Caste have been the most inconsistent with their anima powers throughout editions. In both 1st and 2nd edition, they could have a chance at reducing incoming damage by rolling their essence in dice and removing a damage from each success. In 2nd edition, that anima power was later replaced in the Scroll of Errata with a new power that lets them perceive essence, providing bonuses on rolls to analyze essence effects and to their defense against illusions. 3rd edition gave Twilights another defensive power similar to 1st edition, but instead of having it reduce damage, it increases hardness. In 3rd edition, Twilights can also choose to vanish into their own anima and appear the next Twilight at the closest place of power within 10 miles. Finally, they're able to touch elementals and demons to turn them into familiars. In Exalted Essence, Twilights reduce the difficulty of overcoming obstacles while working on a venture that involves investigation, research or planning. A venture is a mechanic that only exists in Exalted Essence and that I will explain a bit more in the next video. Twilights in Exalted Essence can also add automatic successes to craft and sagacity rolls, including build power and focus will actions. Again, more on what that means later. Finally, they can summon a minor elemental or fur circle demon of their choice, instantly calling it to their side and binding it for the scene. In 1st edition, Nightcast Solars can mute their anima by spending twice the peripheral essence from charms. In 2nd edition, they can also mute their anima, but the cost for doing so is different. It's only twice the cost for charms that are obviously supernatural in nature, as depicted by the obvious charm keyword. For non-obvious charms, the effect can be muted for 1 mode. Sorcery can't be muted at all in 2nd edition, but there are no mentions of that in 1st edition. In both 1st and 2nd edition, Nightcasts can also create an imperceptible veil around themselves to mute the senses of those perceiving them or the evidence they leave behind. In 3rd edition, Nightcasts must spend 2 modes to mute their anima when using charms. They can ignore penalties to stealth attempts, and when their anima is at bonfire or iconic level, it perfectly masks their features. In Exalted Essence, charm expenditures are a bit different, and the Nightcast's ability to mute their anima happens passively until they want it to be seen. The Nightcast also gains a bonus on rolls to pretend to be someone they aren't. As an active effect, they can add automatic successes to stealth and athletics rolls, including build power actions. This same effect makes it impossible to discern the Nightcast's identity. Finally, as an iconic effect, after resolving a successful attack, they can move instantly to any other location in the scene and gain their essence in power. Out of combat, the Nightcast becomes immaterial and can move through solid matter. In 1st edition, Eclipse Cast Solars can sanctify oaths, enforcing terrible curses upon those who break them. They have diplomatic immunity when on legitimate business with demon princes and fairfolk. They can also learn the charms of other exalts and spirits for twice the experience cost. 2nd edition almost copies 1st edition word by word, with the exception that foreign charms carry a 2-mode surcharge. The Scroll of Errata later makes some clarifications and additions to the Eclipse Caste anima power. For example, the Solar cannot cherry-pick foreign charms, they must meet all prerequisites, and permanent charms don't carry the surcharge. In 3rd edition, Eclipses can sanctify oaths just like in previous editions, with the storyteller determining the consequences for oath breakers. They have diplomatic immunity when on legitimate business with shades, spirits, demon princes and fairfolk. The biggest change to Eclipse Caste powers is that they now can only acquire the charms of certain supernatural beings, like spirits and fairfolk, and not the charms of other Exalted. The charm must also carry the Eclipse keyword. In Exalted Essence, Eclipses also have diplomatic immunity, and they can learn foreign charms with the same limitations as in 3rd edition. When it comes to sanctifying oaths, Exalted Essence distinguishes an oath from a greater oath, where breaking the agreement of an oath isn't as serious as breaking a greater oath. In addition, as an iconic effect, everyone in the scene must honor their agreements with other characters in the Eclipse's presence, or suffer an increased difficulty to all actions taken to go back on their word. Because there is a major shift in the mechanics from 3rd edition and onwards, it's expected that there will be major changes to how anima powers are presented in the different editions of the game. However, it's clear that the anima powers become more distinct and powerful as the editions go on, with later editions having much more powerful effects than earlier editions. This makes Exalts in 3rd edition and Exalted Essence stand out much more, and it makes them more interesting. In Exalted Essence, this is even more important, since it carries the risk of making Exalts feel generic when they to a large degree must rely on the same charms. By making anima powers distinct, it can still feel like you're playing different Exalt types. Exalted Essence also introduces something called advantages that give additional features to the different Exalt types apart from simply the different anima powers. The advantages for Solars are first among equals, which lets them win ties on opposed rolls, supremacy of ability, which lets them use excellences for free, and divine resonance, which makes them resonant with all magical materials. If we look at the advantages for Dragonblooded for comparison, they get Prince of the Earth, which lets them once per session treat a merit as if they have a rating equal to their essence in it. 10,000 dragons fight as one improves their ability to make teamwork actions, and Resonance makes them resonant with all types of Jade. First through the 3rd edition uses the same attribute spread where there are 3 categories of attributes: physical, social and mental, and you decide which one is primary, which one is secondary and which one is tertiary. The physical attributes are strength, dexterity and stamina, the social attributes are charisma, manipulation and appearance, and the mental attributes are perception, intelligence and wits. This was left unchanged until Exalted Essence, which simplifies the attributes into 3 approaches: force, finesse and fortitude. Originally in the storyteller system, the 9 attributes were both categorized as physical, social and mental, and into these 3 approaches. While I don't mind that Exalted Essence goes with the 3 instead of the 9, I find it odd that they chose to still use the term attribute to describe them, when approach is a more fitting term. Personally, I would have preferred to keep the 9 attributes in Exalted Essence, since those weren't really the aspects of the game that needed simplification. Abilities, on the other hand, have changed in every edition of the game. In 1st edition, the abilities were archery, athletics, awareness, brawl, bureaucracy, craft, dodge, endurance, investigation, larceny, linguistics, lore, martial arts, medicine, melee, occult, performance, presence, resistance, ride, sail, socialize, stealth, survival and throne. In 2nd edition, brawl was removed and overtaken entirely by martial arts. It was the same for endurance, which was swallowed up by resistance. Instead, 2nd edition added integrity and war as new abilities. 3rd edition went back to separating brawl and martial arts, though martial arts was hidden behind a merit. In 3rd edition, you must also acquire different martial arts abilities for different martial arts styles. The craft ability was similar in both 1st and 3rd edition, where you had to take separate craft abilities for different types of crafting styles, such as blacksmithing or carpentry. 2nd edition streamlined the craft ability by having different crafting styles be represented by one of the 5 elements: air, earth, fire, water and wood. Instead of an endless amount of possible craft abilities, there were 5. In Exalted Essence, there is only a single craft ability that covers all of it. The linguistics ability determined how many languages you knew in 1st and 2nd edition, while 3rd edition had languages represented by merit. Exalted Essence went back to having languages represented by an ability, but it used embassy instead of linguistics, which doesn't exist in Exalted Essence. Once again, Exalted Essence makes the biggest changes to abilities, cutting them down from 25 to 14. Athletics, awareness, close combat, craft, embassy, integrity, navigate, performance, physique, presence, ranged combat, sagacity, stealth, and war. Many of these 14 abilities cover some of the removed ones. For example, athletics now also cover evading attacks. Awareness now covers investigation. Embassy covers both bureaucracy and linguistics. Navigate covers all forms of transport. Physique covers physical feats and resistance. Sagacity covers academic knowledge such as lore, medicine and occult, and stealth also covers what was previously larceny. In 1st, 2nd and 3rd edition, abilities can also have related specialties that add bonus dice to rolls relating to that specialty. 1st and 2nd edition limit the number of specialties to 3 per ability, but they can also offer up to 3 dice to a single roll. In 3rd edition you can have as many specialties as you want in an ability, but you can only use 1 at a time and they only offer a single bonus die. Specialties don't exist as a mechanic in Exalted Essence. The backgrounds from 1st and 2nd edition are much like the merits from 3rd edition and Exalted Essence, in that they are narrative and mechanical benefits to help further customize your Exalt. The ones in the 1st edition core book are allies, artifact, backing, contacts, familiar, followers, influence, mans, mentor and resources. Both 1st and 2nd edition expand upon these in the Player's Guide for 1st edition and Scroll of Heroes for 2nd edition. They then introduce merits, which offer several new options such as physical traits, but also flaws that provide negative traits in exchange for bonus points. This gives multiple new options for customization, but can also lead to players getting inconsequential flaws to optimize their characters. 3rd edition uses merits to encompass innate traits, supernatural traits, purchase traits, and story traits. This expands the list of options drastically, with innate traits covering beneficial characteristics, supernatural traits covering inhuman characteristics, purchase traits covering things you can learn by spending experience points, such as new languages, and story traits covering things you can earn for free through roleplay, such as backing and resources. 3rd edition recognizes the problem with letting flaws provide additional traits and keeps them as optional abilities that you can take for fun, but that don't earn you any additional bonus points. Exalted Essence has merits as well, but in a very diminished form compared to 3rd edition. The argument for this change is to provide some relevant merits while having the character's other traits, such as abilities, be enough to represent most of their characteristics. The ones available in Exalted Essence are allies, artifact, backing, command, contacts, familiar, followers, hearthstone, influence and resources. When comparing backgrounds and merits in all editions, 3rd edition is without a doubt the one where they are the most interesting. They are both mechanically and narratively useful and helpful in further customizing your character. I struggle with selecting merits in Exalted Essence because of the few options and the way the character generation is structured. Instead of simply choosing the value of your merits on a point-by-point basis, the merits in Exalted Essence can be primary, secondary and tertiary, and the group decides together what composition of primary, secondary and tertiary options they should choose. In my opinion, this makes merit selections more convoluted than it's worth. There are similarities in charm design between each edition, with some variations here and there. 1st edition introduces the charm types known as simple, supplemental, reflexive and extraction. Simple charms guide the action, supplemental charms supplement an established action, and reflexive charms don't require actions. Extra attack charms create additional actions in a turn. These don't exist in 3rd edition and Exalted Essence, where rules for action flurries are different. Charms cost motes of essence and sometimes willpower or other resources to use, and their duration can be either instant, follow units of time such as hours or minutes, or follow dramatic units such as turns and scenes. This is the same in all editions. Charms also have keywords that help categorize their effects and give an overview of what to expect from them. First edition doesn't have excellences in the way that later editions do. Instead, it has individual charms that produce additional dice in the way that excellences do, such as Wise Arrow for archery, which lets you buy dice for archery attacks by spending motes. First and second edition have fewer charms than the crunchier third edition, and because the books aren't bloated with charms, they can present each charm tree as pictures of charm connections. This is something that third edition Exalted Essence lack and that fans have put together themselves, but being able to clearly see the charm trees are big positives. When it comes to first and second edition, charm design is concise and to the point. You start out with many fewer charms than you do in third edition, but every charm does something interesting. Many of the charm concepts have survived through all editions and become staple charms for the franchise. Both first and second edition have more than 200 charms in the core book. This is hardly few, but when spread out over 25 abilities, it is much more restrictive than third edition's over 700 charms. First edition has more interesting charms, but there aren't many diverse ways to approach individual abilities. An archery solar is going to look similar to another archery solar. Still, you have plenty of choice in your customization. For third edition, you have many options for each ability, but many of the charms are uninspiring, too situational, or feel like bloat. This is improved in later supplements, but third edition solar charms would definitely benefit from an overhaul. Something else that sticks out in first edition is that it doesn't have martial arts styles. Instead, the charms for the martial arts ability is what second edition calls snake style. Second edition introduces the concept of separate martial arts styles that each have their own charm tree, adding to the number of charms available to players. While second edition has terrestrial and celestial styles to define the power levels between terrestrial and celestial practitioners, third edition lets everyone use every style and instead provides additional or more restrictive features using keywords. Third edition also introduces evocations, which are charm-like powers related to artifacts and other magical items. Exalted Essence does its own thing when it comes to charm design. Because it has a lot of changes to the core mechanics of the game and it introduces all Exalt types in the same book, it needs to present charms in a very different way than previous editions. Charms are divided into universal charms and Exalt charms, but there are also martial arts charms and evocations. To further differentiate charms in the hands of different Exalt types, Exalted Essence introduces modes which give additional or altered features to many charms when used by certain Exalt types. For example, the charm Lightning Speed has the Solar mode Winning Stride Discipline that lets them activate the charm again in the scene for free if they succeed on a roll enhanced by it. The same charm has a Dragon-blooded mode called Bellows Pumping Stride, which leaves a fire hazard in Exalt's wake when using it. In Exalted Essence there are over 120 universal charms, and each Exalt type have about 30 or so unique charms. There are also 13 martial arts styles with their own charms. When designing characters for Exalted Essence, it's important to find ways to visualize the universal charms in ways that feel appropriate for the Exalt type you're playing, but you're ultimately going to be using the same charms a lot, even if you're creating characters of different Exalt types. The charms in Exalted Essence are the ones that feel the most different due to how the dramatic flow is structured. Charms reference the combat steps in which they can be applied, which makes it so that a lot of referencing is necessary before you get used to how it works. The previous editions are more streamlined in how charms can be applied due to the listed charm types. For being a simplified edition of the game, this is one example where Exalted Essence made things more convoluted instead of streamlined. In first and second edition, you could only use one charm at a time unless you paid experience points to form charm combos. You had to choose at least 2 charms that could be synergized in your combo, and then paid an experience cost determined by their combined minimum ability values. When activating the combo, there is a brilliant display of essence that is unmistakably supernatural. You also have to spend a willpower apart from the charm cost to use the combo to begin with. Second edition later changed the rules for combos in the Scroll of Errata, making it possible to combine charms freely if they synergized. This was implemented in third edition from the start. In Exalted Essence you can freely use charms outside of combat. In combat you are limited to 1 charm per combat step. I am the kind of player who likes to have many options, so I can bury myself in the vast charm trees of 3rd edition without too much effort. But even I think that 3rd edition went too far in a way that harmed the game more than benefited it. A lot of players come into 3rd edition and get choice paralysis when they're about to select charms and then never look back. Many of the players who stick around can't keep track of their many charms and leave many of them unused. The fact that you start with 15 charms is another bad choice, since fewer charms that are more interesting would be better game design. But even with this major flaw, later 3rd edition supplements have improved upon charm design to avoid effects that are too situational or that act like bloat. The many solar charms that do a simple dice trick or give a bonus without an extra flair don't exist to the same degree for the published splats, since more care has been taken into making each charm more evocative and interesting. Unfortunately, this leaves the solar charms behind, since they don't stand up to par with newer material. A few years ago I started a video series where I wanted to overhaul the solar charms for this purpose. I might continue that series at some point, at least if there's enough interest in it. I would have to go back to make changes to some of the abilities I already covered though. Sorcery has been a thing in all editions of Exalted, and its long history with the myth of Bridget was part of the initial 1st edition worldbuilding as outlined in the Book of Three Circles. 1st and 2nd edition referenced the 5 quests as part of the initiation into sorcery. These quests corresponded to the 5 positions of the sun and the 5 solar castes. During each quest, the student discovered a vital lesson on the path towards becoming a sorcerer. Initially, sorcery was also impossible to learn for mortals. 3rd edition makes sorcery more available, as it adds diverse sorcerer's initiations in place of the 5 quests, and it makes it possible for mortals to become sorcerers. Though mortal sorcerers are no longer seen as mortals after their initiation. 3rd edition also introduces the concept of sorcerer's workings, where you can create lasting sorcerer's effects as projects. This made sorcery more interesting and expanded its use beyond spells. 3rd edition also introduces the concept of control spells, where you are permanently marked by one of your spells, either changing the sorcerer themselves or the way that the spell is used. In 1st edition, the time it takes to cast spells is determined by the spell circle, with 1st circle spells being shaped into existence on the character's action the next turn. 2nd circle spells require 1 additional turn of shaping, and 3rd circle spells require 2 additional turns of shaping. In 1st and 2nd edition you also spend your own motes of essence to cast the spells. This is different from 3rd edition, which introduced the Sorcerer's Mote, where you take actions to channel the mote cost required to activate a spell from the world around you, with the spell being completed once all motes have been channeled. Exalted Essence uses a similar system, but instead of channeling Sorcerer's Motes, you focus will. Necromancy hasn't had its proper introduction in 3rd edition yet, since it will come with Abyssal Book, but it functions similar to sorcery, and many listed spells can be reflavored into necromancy spells. For being an edition with an overabundance of charms, 3rd edition has largely been lacking in spells, and it would have benefited from a sorcerer-focused supplement, but that's unlikely to happen at this point. In 1st and 2nd edition, characters have 4 virtues represented by compassion, conviction, temperance and valor that can range from 1 to 5. These can be used to add dice to actions that are in accordance with the virtue, but also restrict certain actions that contest the virtue, forcing virtue rolls to determine if the character can go through with action. Virtues define the character's personality and morality, and one of them is tied to the Great Curse through something called a virtue flaw. More on that later. 2nd edition also uses the virtues to define a character's flaw of invulnerability, which is a condition for when perfect defenses aren't applicable. Because of how perfect attacks and defenses created what is known as 2nd edition's paranoia combat, the concept was removed in 3rd edition. 2nd edition introduces Intimacies alongside the virtues to give further narrative expression to the character. 3rd edition removes virtues but keeps and elaborates on Intimacies. Virtues are brought back in Exalted Essence, but instead of using the 4 virtues from 1st and 2nd edition, Exalted Essence has 7: ambition, compassion, courage, discipline, justice, loyalty and wonder. The player chooses a major virtue and a minor virtue, which together with their intimacies are meant to drive their actions. I am of the opinion that virtues are an unnecessary addition to Exalted Essence because of how Intimacies are implemented, and because it's one additional feature to keep track of in a game that aims to streamline the 3rd edition experience. They don't add anything meaningful to the game that Intimacies can't already do. One of the staples of Exalted is the Great Curse, the punishment enacted by the Primordials upon all Exalted. In 1st and 2nd edition, characters have a flaw associated with one of the virtues, and that flaw has a limit break condition attached to it. Whenever the condition is met, the player rolls dice equal to their virtue and gains a point of limit for each success. When they reach 10 limits, they suffer a limit break. The character is now ruled by their flaw for at least a scene. Virtue flaws can be extreme and destructive. Compassionate martyrdom forces the character to help the suffering regardless of consequence, such as taking someone's burden from them or stepping in front of a whip. Deliberate cruelty compels the character to close their heart to pity and embrace cruelty. Berserk anger causes the character to lose control and rage, becoming hostile to everything around that moves. In 1st edition, the player must roleplay the curse in full, or the storyteller does so for them. In 2nd edition, characters can partially control their actions during a limit break, but doing so prevents them from recovering willpower from it. This meant that completely succumbing to it is more cathartic, but players have more agency over how their characters react to it. In 3rd edition, there are no virtues to tie limit break conditions to. Instead, players have more freedom in phrasing a limit trigger, and you always roll the same number of dice since there are no virtue ratings to refer to. But perhaps the main difference in how 3rd edition handles the Great Curse is that the specific expression of the Great Curse varies based on what makes sense for the scene. Instead of simply choosing that your character enters compassionate martyrdom or deliberate cruelty like in 1st and 2nd edition, in 3rd edition you can enter compassionate martyrdom in certain scenarios and deliberate cruelty in others. The storyteller is the one who chooses the expression and the player is acting it out. In Exalted Essence, every Exalt type has their own conditions for and manifestations of the Great Curse, but you don't accrue limit in the way you did in previous editions. Instead, when an inciting event occurs, the storyteller, the character's player, or another player can suggest the Great Curse expresses itself. In other words, instead of rolling for limit to see when it can express itself, you have more freedom in choosing when you want it to express itself. Have the conditions been met, and is there narrative value? In my years of playing Exalted, accruing limit and expressing the Great Curse is often something that I keep forgetting about. I prefer the way Exalted Essence handles it, because then you don't have to bother keeping a limit track and can instead simply have it appear when appropriate. This video is long enough as it is, but before we close out I want to talk a bit about items and how they differ between editions. The resources background in 1st and 2nd edition indicates what kind of stuff a character can buy. If an item is listed as having a resources cost lower than the character's resources rating, they can buy it as an insignificant expense. When buying an item of equal value to resources, the character lowers the resources value by 1 until it can be increased through roleplaying. A character cannot buy items with a value higher than the resources rating. 3rd edition references the resources merit in similar vein, but doesn't go into the same detail as 1st and 2nd edition on significant expenses. Exalted Essence simplifies things even further by reducing resources to 3 ratings instead of 5. Both 1st and 2nd edition also far surpasses 3rd edition and Exalted Essence when it comes to listing everyday items. It's understood in 3rd edition and Exalted Essence that most everyday items that don't offer special mechanics should be entirely abstracted. The only items apart from weapons and armor that are listed in 3rd edition and Exalted Essence are things like Ghost Flower Tea and talismans, which have clear mechanical effects. 3rd edition and Exalted Essence also simplify weapons and armor to a degree that 1st and 2nd edition don't. In 1st edition, a weapon has a speed, accuracy, damage and defense rating, where speed is added to or subtracted from the character's initiative roll when wielding the weapon. Accuracy is added to the dice pool when making the attack roll, damage is added to the strength plus extra successes to determine damage in combat, and defense is added to the dexterity plus ability total when parrying with the weapon. Weapons can also have trait minimums required to use them. Ranged weapons work the same, but has a rate and a range rating, where rate is the maximum number of arrows that can be fired in a given turn, and range defines the distance you fire it at without a penalty. Twice the range is at a -2 penalty, and 3 times the range is at a -4 penalty. Second edition uses similar traits to first edition, but speed works differently in second edition. Instead of affecting initiative, it affects the number of ticks your attack action takes in combat. This ties into the speed wheel of second edition combat rules, which I'll talk more about in the next video. Third edition simplifies weapon rules by categorizing them as light, medium and heavy, where every weapon within each category has the same basic traits. Instead, certain weapons can have additional tags to add variety, such as the smashing or piercing tags. There are no speed ratings in third edition, but the overwhelming rating indicates the minimum damage inflicted on withering attacks. Exalted Essence is very similar to third edition in how it implements weapon traits. In first and second edition, armor have soak values for both lethal and bashing damage, as well as mobility penalty and fatigue values. The mobility penalty is subtracted from all rolls requiring agility or balance, and the fatigue rating is the difficulty of the armor's fatigue roll. This is a stamina plus endurance roll made when the character wears the armor, with a risk of accumulating penalties due to soreness and fatigue. Fatigue isn't a thing in third edition since it was a superfluous and annoying mechanic. Second edition also adds hardness to magical armor. In combat, raw damage is compared to hardness to see if it can harm the character at all. Third edition has a similar implementation of hardness, but only applies it to decisive attacks. In Exalted Essence, characters have an innate hardness equal to their essence plus 2 and add the hardness from armor onto that. How it works is something I'm going to say for the next video. The last thing I want to talk about is artifacts and magical materials. In first and second edition, characters gain special bonuses to traits if they attune to artifacts made from the magical material they resonate with, orichalcum for solars and moonsilver for lunars, etc. If a character wants the bonuses from a material they don't resonate with, they must commit twice the motes when attuning to the artifact. They also have to succeed on a wits plus lore roll at difficulty 3. Third edition changes resonances, but there were issues during the development of the core book that made the developers go back and forth on how to implement it. The idea was for Exalts to have resonances and dissonances based on various magical materials. For example, solars would be resonant with all materials, while Dragonblooded would only be resonant with jade. Since third edition also introduces the concept of evocations, which I mentioned earlier, the developers wanted to tie resonances and dissonances to how evocations were expressed. Earlier in development, they experimented with using tiers of access, where certain characters could access emerald, sapphire or adamant tiers of evocations. This was scrapped before release. Instead, they decided to go with the same system that they used for martial arts charms, where the mastery or the terrestrial keywords indicated greater or lesser effects. However, this system was decided upon after the release of the core book, so the third edition core book doesn't present resonant or dissonant effects in its list of artifacts. This was first introduced in the Arms of the Chosen supplement and has carried forth in every supplement since. Exalted Essence implements resonance in the forms of modes, like the charm modes I mentioned earlier. They only use a resonant mode though, having skipped dissonance entirely. When breaking down the player experience for each edition of Exalted, there are positives and negatives in every edition. First and second edition had worse anima powers, but second edition was much better in that regard. It also suffered from a flawed rule set that I'm going to talk more about in the next video. But second edition in particular devolved into an insufferable paranoia combat, where you had to invest in very particular sets of charms to survive perfect attacks or overcome perfect defenses. The fact that you had to purchase combos separately in first edition and early second edition was another hurdle that slowed down progression. While second edition improved on a lot of first edition features, its massive list of errata makes it a hurdle to keep track of all the changes made to the rules and traits. Third edition improved on a lot when it comes to how the game ran, and it made both sorcery and artifacts much more interesting and useful. The issue with third edition is that it suffered from bloated charm trees with effects that were too situational or inconsequential. Compared to first and second edition, it was still a largely better and more fluid gaming experience, but it's a headache to keep track of everything your character can do and has access to. I still think it's a better experience overall than first and second edition, once you get past the initial hurdles, but the initial hurdles are much more massive than they should have been. Exalted Essence is a generally better designed system and a more welcoming core book, but it's a misconception that it's a streamlined or simplified version of 3rd edition. It's a variant of pretty much equal complexity, but that is presented in a better way. While you have fewer choices than the previous editions, you can still choose every Exalt type there is and get a rather complete experience. Despite it not actually being easier than 3rd edition, I think it's overall a better entry point for new players because it has plenty of storyteller advice. So far, we've talked about the evolution of the gameline itself in the first video, the world building and the controversies in the previous video, and we talked about the player experience in this video. Next up, I'm going to talk about the rules of all editions, how they compare and what the pros and cons are between editions. If you watch this video when it comes out, the next one is already available on my Patreon, but will be available on YouTube in about a week. Until next time.